I remember the coffee in the lawyer's office more than anything. Bitter, overbrewed, and sitting in one of those brown glass carafes from another century. Fitting, I guess, for what was supposed to be a somber, respectable gathering. But what it became was something else entirely. My name is Evan Burke. I'm 38 years old, and 3 weeks ago I buried my father, a man I had, for most of my adult life, considered complicated, distant, sometimes cold, always calculating, but not cruel. In his final year, after a long battle with heart disease, we had tried in our own way to find peace. I called weekly, visited when I could, sent him books mostly about old architecture or World War II aircraft, things he loved as a young man but had long since abandoned in retirement. Our relationship wasn't perfect, but it was mending. The funeral was quiet, respectful, held at a stone chapel in Vermont where he used to fish as a kid. My siblings Colin and Beth did most of the organizing. I stayed out of the way. I assumed we were all there to grieve. That assumption died the minute we sat down for the will reading. The attorney's office looked like something out of a 1980s courtroom drama. Thick oak furniture, brass lamps, books that hadn't been opened in years. Beth wore a soft gray sweater and kept tapping her nails on the armrest. Colin wouldn't look at me. And when the lawyer, a tired man with bags under his eyes and a comb-over that didn't fool anyone, began reading, I braced myself for the usual mix of sentiment and estate itemization. At first everything sounded standard. The property was to be sold. Personal possessions would be distributed according to preference forms, assuming no disputes. Beth was given power over the artwork. Colin would receive the lake house in Maine. Then the air changed. The lawyer reached the end and said, "And with that, the estate is settled. The will includes no other named beneficiaries." No mention of me. Not one line. Not even a sentence about why. Just nothing. Silence sat heavy in the room. I didn't move, didn't ask questions, didn't frown or protest, but I noticed everything. Beth gave the faintest shrug. Colin let out a breath he'd been holding, the kind of breath you release when something goes exactly the way you planned. I reached down beside my chair and tapped once on the shoulder of the man who came with me. He stood calmly and placed a folder on the table. "I'd like to raise an objection to the validity of the document," he said, "on behalf of Mr. Evan Burke." The lawyer blinked. "Excuse me?" "My name is Kenneth Doyle," he said, firm but polite. "I represent Mr. Burke in this matter. We are in possession of a prior version of the will, notarized and signed, in which my client is listed as a named beneficiary. Furthermore, we have cause to believe that the updated version was executed during a period in which Mr. Burke's father was legally considered medically unfit to amend legal documents. You could have heard a pin drop. Even the bitter coffee stopped steaming. I hadn't wanted it to be this way. I really hadn't. But I knew something was wrong a month before Dad passed. Our phone calls had become shorter, hesitant, almost scripted. I'd ask a question and he'd pause like someone else was in the room. Sometimes the calls went unanswered altogether. When I asked Beth if he was okay, she said, "He's tired. You don't need to bother him every week." The last time I saw him in person, I brought him a biography of a pilot he admired. He didn't remember our last conversation. He seemed foggy, a little scared, but he still smiled when I handed him the book. That was the last real moment I had with him. Weeks later, I got a message from Marie, one of the caretakers at the home. She wasn't supposed to contact me directly, but she did. "Mr. Burke," she said in a low voice, "you should check in on your father's legal paperwork. Something's changed. I'm not sure it's right." That's when I hired Kenneth, and we started preparing just in case. The call from Marie wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. She'd taken care of my father for nearly a year, and while she was always professional, she also had a conscience. "I probably shouldn't be saying this," she told me in a quiet voice, "but there's been a lot of talk about changing paperwork lately, mostly between your brother and a woman from legal. And your dad's been too out of it to even sign his meal receipts." That was the moment the hairs on my neck stood up. I thanked her and didn't ask more. I didn't want to get her in trouble, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. My father and I weren't best friends. We didn't talk about feelings, but he had written me an email 6 months earlier, one that I saved. In it, he said, I'm sorry for the years I wasn't around. You turned out better than I deserved. When I get things finalized this year, I'd like to make sure you're part of what I leave behind. I read that email again, then called a friend who worked in estate law. He said, "You need to get ahead of this, quietly." That's how I met Kenneth Doyle. A soft-spoken, razor-sharp estate attorney with a specialty in disputed wills. We had coffee that week. I explained what I knew. He didn't react with drama. Just nodded, made notes, and asked me 3 questions. Do you have any documented communication from your father about his wishes? Has he been declared medically unfit in the past 12 months? Who currently holds power of attorney? The answers were yes, yes, and Colin. Kenneth blinked slowly. That's the trifecta, he said. We'll need records, medical notes, and a time-stamped copy of the previous will. I had the last one. It was scanned and saved from a conversation I had with my father the year prior. He'd wanted me to review it for a clause about charitable donations. At the time, I thought it was just a courtesy. Now it was a lifeline. The medical note came next. Kenneth filed a records request under the pretext of estate planning. A doctor had written, just 6 weeks before Dad's passing, that he exhibited marked cognitive decline with evidence of confusion and memory fragmentation. In short, my father legally lacked the capacity to alter major documents. That should have been the end of it, but Kenneth knew better. Just because something's illegal doesn't mean it won't be processed, he said. We need to have everything lined up and wait for the moment. That moment was the will reading. I didn't tell Beth or Colin I was bringing representation. Kenneth posed as a friend dressed in a plain charcoal blazer, carried a soft leather brief. He didn't even bring a briefcase. Just a folder. One folder. Inside, the earlier version of the will. Medical records. Email, correspondence. Financial activity logs. Everything time-stamped. Everything airtight. And still, until the very second my name was left off the will, I didn't fully believe they'd go through with it. It felt surreal, like watching a heist unfold in slow motion. Only this time I wasn't the one planning it. I was the one being robbed, but I was also the one holding the security footage. Looking back, there were signs. Colin was always talking about streamlining Dad's assets. Beth had started hinting that the lake house was too much for Dad to manage, and should just stay in the family. I had dismissed it all as normal end-of-life stress, but now I saw it clearly. They thought they could rewrite history, make me disappear from the narrative, and because I'd been quiet, distant, not as we involved day to day, they assumed I wouldn't fight. But here's the thing. I may not have shown up for every planning meeting, but I was the one who fixed Dad's car when it broke down in the middle of winter. I was the one who flew across the country when he slipped on ice and wouldn't tell anyone. I was the one who stayed overnight in that hospital chair because Beth had a dentist appointment. They thought paperwork was power. I knew better. I brought a lawyer. The moment Kenneth placed the folder on the table, the energy in the room shifted. Beth sat back in her chair like someone just whispered a threat behind her ear. Colin's brow tightened, not confusion, but recognition. He knew exactly what was in that folder. He just hadn't expected me to bring it. The estate lawyer leaned forward, peering over his glasses at the documents Kenneth slid gently across the polished table. "What am I looking at?" he asked. Kenneth was calm. "A notarized version of Mr. Burke's will dated 11 months ago. It names my client, Evan Burke, as a beneficiary to a portion of the liquid estate, and includes a handwritten note outlining Mr. Burke's wishes regarding each of his children." The lawyer blinked. "That's not the version I received." "That's not surprising," Kenneth replied, "because the version you received is tainted. The updated document was signed during a period in which Mr. Burke's physician, he tapped a highlighted section, had declared him legally incapacitated due to cognitive impairment." Beth's hand flew to her chest. "That's not true." Kenneth turned to her. "It's in his medical file, and your name is listed as his medical proxy on the day the update was made." Silence again, thick and suffocating. Colin, ever the quick thinker, leaned forward. "This doesn't prove anything." "People forget things all the time. That doesn't mean he wasn't of sound mind." Kenneth nodded. "That's fair. Which is why we've also included his bank activity from that week." He pulled out another sheet. A $9,000 withdrawal was made from Mr. Burke's account 3 days after he was declared medically unfit. A day later, the revised will was signed and notarized. Same day, same location. I assume you were both present? Colin opened his mouth, then closed it again. The estate attorney looked increasingly uncomfortable. I wasn't aware of any of this. I was told this update had full medical clearance. Kenneth slid over a copy of the email that had been sent to the notary public using Beth's email address. Beth turned red. I didn't forge anything. You didn't have to, Kenneth said. Coercion doesn't require forgery. It only requires influence over someone who's too weak to understand what they're signing. At this point, the lawyer quietly set his pen down and removed his glasses. I think we need to suspend this reading pending further review. Beth stood up suddenly. This is ridiculous. Evan didn't even visit Dad in his last month. I stood too. Slowly. That's because every time I called, you said he was sleeping. Every time I offered to fly in, you told me not to. Every single message I sent went unanswered. Colin jumped in. You're twisting this. No, I said. You are. You both are. And I let it go because I didn't want a family war. I didn't want to assume the worst, but you made sure I wasn't just left out of decisions. You erased me from the man's final wishes. Beth's voice cracked. He wanted it that way. Then why did he write me this? I pulled up the printed email, the one where my father apologized, where he said he wanted me to be part of what he left behind. The lawyer read it. Quietly, then nodded. We'll be halting probate until this is reviewed in court. I didn't smile, didn't gloat, just gathered my things. Kenneth did the same. As we walked out, I caught one last glance at Beth and Colin. Their world had just shifted under them. They hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from me, but they didn't know how long I'd been preparing. They thought I was walking into that room alone, expecting a payout. They didn't realize I came in already knowing the will was fake and already having the legal foundation to tear it apart. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about principle. You could feel it settle like a second layer of air, that tension that no one acknowledges, but everyone breathes. After the estate lawyer declared probate paused, no one moved. The chairs didn't squeak. No one reached for the coffee anymore. It was as if the temperature in the room had actually dropped 10 degrees. Beth's arms were crossed now, her jaw set in that rigid way she used to get when we were kids, and she knew she'd been caught in a lie. Colin kept glancing at the door, like he expected someone to interrupt, like a fire drill might save him. But nothing did. The lawyer started packing the files. He didn't say anything further. He didn't need to. He knew this had spiraled into something far outside his control. Once Kenneth brought up the medical declaration and time-stamped bank withdrawal, the conversation stopped being about family disagreements and became something else: fraud. What they'd done wasn't just morally wrong, it was legally actionable, and everyone in the room now understood that. I watched Colin pull out his phone and type something. Beth leaned toward him to look, probably calling a lawyer of their own. I didn't blame them. If I were in their shoes, I'd be scared too. But I wasn't, because for the first time since my father passed, I knew I wasn't going to be erased. Kenneth stood slowly, his calm professionalism never slipping. "We'll see you all in court," he said softly. Not smug, just certain. We left the building without looking back, but I knew that room, that moment, would stay with them, because it had changed the story. No longer were they the siblings handling the estate. They were now under the microscope, each decision subject to legal review. In the elevator down, Kenneth turned to me. "They panicked early. That'll help. People who panic leave trails." I nodded. "Think we'll win?" He gave a half smile. "We already are." That was the first time I felt something crack loose inside me. Not anger, not satisfaction. Something simpler, a weight starting to lift. I didn't go back home right away. I walked 2 blocks down to a little park bench near the courthouse, sat down and called Marie, the nurse, who first warned me. She answered in a whisper. "It happened, didn't it?" "It did," I said. "And because of you, I was ready." What followed was 2 weeks of silence, legally advised silence. No messages from Beth or Colin, no updates from the estate lawyer, just prep from Kenneth. We filed a petition to stay probate and freeze all estate disbursements. The court granted it without hesitation. The medical documentation and financial trail spoke for themselves. Then came the subpoenas. Colin was ordered to submit his communications with the notary and his financial records from the month of the will update. Beth was asked to provide copies of all care directives and contact logs with medical providers. They fought it briefly, but not hard, because they knew what was in those files, and they knew it wouldn't end well. Eventually, their lawyer reached out to Kenneth. A meeting was requested. Not a public hearing, a settlement discussion. That meant one thing. They wanted to make this go away. The meeting took place in a private conference room, much quieter than the first. No recordings, no dramatics. Just lawyers, documents, and 3 people who now understood exactly where this was headed. Colin didn't speak at all. Beth did most of the talking, or rather, apologizing. "We weren't trying to steal anything," she said. "It just felt like Dad was closer to us. You didn't see him as much. We thought maybe it made more sense for us to carry things forward." I said nothing. Kenneth did. "Intent is one thing," he said. "Execution is another. And what you executed was a fraudulent will, using a medical proxy, after your father was declared incapacitated. If this goes to court, you'll both face civil liability, possibly more." Beth lowered her eyes. "What do you want?" Kenneth laid it out clean. "Full reinstatement of the prior will. Formal acknowledgement that the recent update is void, a signed affidavit that neither party will contest again, and a donation made in my father's name to a senior legal defense fund." They agreed. Quietly. Not because they wanted to, because they had no other option. We could have ended it at the settlement table. Just one signature from each of them. A court-stamped copy reinstating the original will, and the estate would have been back on track. But Colin didn't sign. He couldn't. Whether it was pride, fear, or some belief that he could spin the story, he dug in. Beth had already folded. She saw the writing on the wall. But Colin? He wanted a fight, so we gave him one. The court date was scheduled within weeks. The judge overseeing the case was known for being no-nonsense, particularly when it came to elder abuse or financial misconduct. That played in our favor. Kenneth compiled everything, not just the documents, but the full timeline. Dates of mental decline, doctor visits, notary logs, care home security sign-ins. It wasn't just a case, it was a narrative. And it told a clear story. A man near the end of his life, confused and vulnerable, whose wishes were overwritten by those who should have protected him. Colin arrived to the courtroom with a new lawyer and a fresh haircut, as if dressing sharper would erase the trail of mistakes behind him. He didn't speak at first. His lawyer did all the posturing claimed. The original will was incomplete, that Colin acted out of concern, that the new version reflected a verbal update from their father. It sounded convincing. For about 5 minutes. Then Kenneth stood. "We're not here because someone misunderstood a conversation," Kenneth began. "We're here because someone rewrote the legal reality of a dying man. And they did it with full awareness that he no longer had the capacity to consent." He handed up the email Colin sent the notary, timing it, just 3 hours after a doctor's note had been entered into his father's chart, stating he was exhibiting early-onset dementia. Then came the care home sign-in log, showing Colin was the only visitor for that entire week. Then, finally, the medical report showing the decline, the one no lawyer in the room could explain away. Colin didn't look up. Not when the judge read through the evidence, not when Beth testified nervously, reluctantly, that she had gone along with it, because it seemed easier than fighting her brother. The judge's decision wasn't dramatic, just clean. The updated will is invalidated on the basis of undue influence and mental incapacity of the testator. The original document will stand. Mr. Evan Burke is to be reinstated as a named beneficiary. Any distributions made based on the amended document are to be returned or adjusted accordingly. Bang of the gavel. Done. There was no applause, just the slow shuffling of paper, lawyers nodding at each other, and a final glance between siblings that carried years of silence. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still. It wasn't about winning anymore. It was about clearing the record. I didn't want to be remembered as the estranged son who missed too many phone calls. I wanted to be remembered as someone who showed up when it counted. In the weeks that followed, the estate resumed processing. I received a formal letter from the lawyer, this time with my name printed clearly at the top, a share of the estate, a few pieces of personal property, and a note handwritten, in my father's signature that had been tucked into his desk. It simply said, "To Evan, I hope this helps you feel what I never said out loud. I'm proud of you." That broke me more than anything else had. Colin never called me. Not once. Beth did. A short voicemail halfway between apology and justification. I didn't return it. Instead, I used a portion of the inheritance to start something small. A fund in my father's name to provide legal support for seniors dealing with estate manipulation. It wasn't much, but it mattered. Kenneth declined his bonus. Said the win was payment enough. I sent him a bottle of good scotch anyway. The last thing I did before closing the file on all of it was revisit the old lake house, the one Colin had tried to take. It was empty now, left to the market. I walked through it slowly, smelled the old pine. Looked out across the dock where we'd once sat silently with fishing rods in our hands. The memories were soft, some sharp. But none of them fake, and that's what mattered. I hadn't just restored my name in the will, I'd restored my place in the story. There's a strange kind of quiet that comes after a storm you didn't start but finished. That's how it felt the day the estate closed and the final check cleared. No celebration, no calls, just a formal envelope, my name typed neatly on the front, and a letter confirming that everything had been resolved. Legally anyway, emotionally it took longer. I kept thinking about the will, not the paper, but what it meant. Not just who got what, but how people tried to control the legacy of a man who was no longer here to defend himself. A will is supposed to reflect what someone stood for, their values, their regrets, their hopes for the people they leave behind. And yet, without a shred of shame, my siblings tried to turn it into a tool, a weapon to erase me from our father's final chapter. But I didn't let them. And in the quiet after the courtroom, I found something unexpected. Not rage, not revenge. Peace. I drove back to Vermont that spring, not for business, not for legal work. Just to stand by the chapel where we'd held the service. The snow had melted, the lake was thawing, and the chapel doors were locked, but I didn't need to go inside. I sat on a bench nearby, the same one I used to visit when Dad was in the care home down the road. He always loved this spot, something about the view of the waterline and the way the wind came off the pines. This time I brought the old leather journal I'd found in his things, the one with half-finished thoughts, notes to himself, old grocery lists, and in the back, a list of people I need to make things right with. My name was on it, crossed out. Not with anger, just closure. He'd tried. I saw that now, even if his mind gave out before he could say it the way he wanted. The earlier will, the email, the conversations from last year, they were all his way of repairing what time had frayed. The truth is, I never needed the money. I have a decent career, a roof over my head, friends who show up when it counts. What I needed was to know that I wasn't forgotten, that all those quiet years where I still called, still visited, still tried, even when he didn't mattered. Getting written out of the will felt like being erased, like the final word was silence. But now? I'd written something different. I donated a small sum in his name to a senior legal support group, one that helps vulnerable elders deal with power of attorney abuse and coercion. I didn't put my name on the donation page, just his, no plaque, no newsletter mention, just one line, in honor of Raymond Burke, who taught me how to hold the line even after you're gone, and I meant it. I still don't talk to Colin. Beth sent a holiday card a few months later. I opened it, looked at it, then slid it into a drawer. I wasn't ready. Maybe I never will be. Some things I've learned don't need to be resolved, just placed, filed in the past, where they belong. Closure doesn't always come with an apology. Sometimes it's a door. You close yourself. And when I left Vermont that last time, I didn't say goodbye. I just drove home with the journal beside me on the seat, the windows down, and the simple, quiet knowledge that no one else would ever write me out of my own story again.